He had everything a young American could dream of: fame, fortune, and a future carved in stadium lights. The roar of a crowd was the background rhythm of his days, a drumbeat that promised more applause with every season. Yet one quiet morning, when the sun spilled pale across the bathroom mirror, he confronted a question that would outgrow the blare of the scoreboard and echo through every decision that followed. What does it mean to serve something bigger than yourself? This is the unbelievable story of Pat Tillman, a man who walked away from millions to fight for a country he believed needed him more than the spotlight did. Pat Tillman did not arrive on the stage as a perfect silhouette of athletic myth. He arrived as a boy who climbed walls not because he needed to conquer them, but because someone dared him to see what lay beyond the edge. Fremont, California, a suburb of ambition and sun-baked streets, was his childhood ground. Neighbors would later recall a kid who turned the ordinary into something bold, a smile that flashed before a challenge, and a refusal to blink when the obstacle loomed. He wasn't tall by NFL standards, a shade undersized, barely tipping 5'11". Yet his heart stretched beyond measure, a stubborn boat against the current of expected physique. He wore his energy openly, a spark that drew both friends and teachers into a chorus of quiet awe. In those homespun years, the world was not a stadium. It was a street, a basketball hoop, a dusty field behind a school. At Arizona State University, the field transformed under his feet. He carried a simple creed: work hard, show up, tell the truth, and watched doubt melt under the heat of practice. In 1997, he helped his team confound the odds, guiding them toward an undefeated season that culminated in the Rose Bowl. He spoke in a voice that came from somewhere deeper than nerves, interviews that were sharp and unvarnished. A man who seemed to measure success not by trophies, but by the measure of his own conviction. Drafted by the Arizona Cardinals in the 7th round, Pat's ascent pressed through the cracks of doubt. By his second year, he had earned a starting role at safety, a fact that felt almost astonished against the odds. Sponsors found him, reporters liked him, a public persona began to take hold. But beneath the roar of the crowd, something steadier lived inside him, a quiet conviction that success, splendid as it was, needed a horizon beyond itself. He moved with a calm foot, not because fearless courage was without tremor, but because fear was a thing he learned to walk with, not against. He believed that achievement meant little in the absence of purpose. If glory was a height, he aimed for a purpose greater than the climb. He had made it to the top, and that exactly when he started climbing back down, because the higher you rise, the clearer the fall looks from above. Then came the year that bent entire nations and recalibrated personal loyalties, 2001. September arrived not as a headline, but as a weather pattern that changed how people breathed. The smoke over Manhattan wasn't merely an image on a screen. It pressed into every room, every conversation, every decision. Pat and his brother Kevin, a minor league baseball player with a grin that could soften a tough locker room, sat in quiet reflection. They offered each other nothing more than silence, a shared understanding that life had shifted beneath their feet in sudden, irreparable ways. No grand speeches, no slogans, just the weight of a world now asking what it meant to be brave in a country that had suddenly learned to fear claiming too much. In the months that followed, Pat refused the shorthand of heroism. He read deeply: history, philosophy, the stubborn voices of Emerson and Thoreau, and he began to ask the hard questions about what heroism could mean when comfort is not guaranteed. He told friends, with the plain clarity that belonged to a man who had learned to listen more than he spoke, that his great-grandfather fought in World War II, that his family had fought in every war, and that there would be a cost to be paid for pleading ignorance when others carried the weight of duty. The moment of choice came not in a blazing press conference, but in a quiet office in the heady, predictable rhythms of a contract season. In 2002, the Cardinals offered Pat a contract worth nearly $3.6 million. The money was a line drawn in the air, a representation of a life spent counting yards and applause, and the bright, tangible rewards of professional achievement. He did not haggle. He did not hedge. He walked into the general manager's office, a room that smelled of coffee and strategy, and thanked the team for the opportunity, then told them he was leaving, not for another club, but for the U.S. Army. The announcement was not a thunderclap, but a quiet decision that traveled from his core outward, a choice that would force the world to reframe what it meant to be a man of courage. The response was immediate and loud. Sports analysts gasped. Talk shows debated for weeks. The public wrestled with the paradox of an athlete trading a lucrative future for the unknown. Why would anyone trade the NFL for Afghanistan? They asked, as if the question were too intimate to hold in the same breath as a game-changing touchdown. For Pat, the answer rested less on a destination and more on a purpose. It wasn't about where he would go. It was about why. Within the same week, he and Kevin enlisted together, stepping into a future they could not fully map, signing their names with the same calm certainty that had marked so many of his previous decisions. No cameras, no spectacle, just two brothers stepping into history. Millions dream of wearing a jersey. Pat Tillman dreamed of wearing the flag, and that dream was about to test every conviction he'd ever held. The road from private jets to dawn marches was not a single road, but a map of small, relentless changes. Basic training hit like a shockwave, removing all buffer between him and the day's truth. There are no shortcuts here. The chatter of locker rooms faded to the cadence of drills. The private interviews with reporters dissolved into the quiet, intense discipline of a soldier's day. Friends and fellow soldiers would remember him not as the football guy, but as one of them, a man who refused special treatment, who would not allow his fame to pull him to a path of ease. When commanders offered levers that could pull strings for an easier path, he refused. He said simply, "I'm no better than any other man here." He studied the manuals with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. Nights found him poring over field manuals, age-worn pages turning under the soft glow of a lamp, his mind absorbing every tactic, every line of code for survival and duty. He sought Ranger School, a proving ground that would test not only strength, but the very fiber of his moral compass. And he trained with a threshold of exhaustion that would have broken a lesser resolve. In 2003, Pat and Kevin completed Ranger training together, one of the Army's steepest, most demanding routes. They were deployed first to Iraq, a place where the line between courage and fear blurred in the heat of moments that demanded an answer, not a justification. Pat rarely wrote about combat itself in his letters. When he did, the words spoke of morality and meaning, of the human cost of conflict, and the quiet, stubborn resolve to face whatever lay ahead without flinching. In one line, recovered from his reflections, he wrote, "War is brutal, ugly, and in many ways, futile, but it also reveals who we are when there's nothing left to hide behind." The sentiment carried a weight that suggested a man who believed that heroism was not a spectacle of victory, but a discipline of truth. These words reveal a man wrestling between ideals and reality, the tension of patriotism and the haunting truth of violence, a tension that would shape every later decision with a gravity that no public banner could fully illuminate. Heroes aren't born on battlefields. They reforged in the silence before the first shot is fired. In the moment, a man decides who he really is. Between deployments, Pat returned home with a quiet gravity. He did not seek a media spotlight. He sought the ordinary, the human. He met old teammates and friends, but he did not seek to recreate the past. Instead, he asked about families, about the small, living details of life that remind a person there is a future worth protecting. A teammate's casual remark, "Man, you could have been rich by now," found its echo in Pat's simple retort, a line that would become a testament to the way he measured value. "I already am, just in a different currency." The currency he spoke of was not cash, but something more intangible and enduring. The currency of time, of shared lives, of the responsibility to leave something worth inheriting. In those quiet moments, he began reading about Afghanistan's tribal dynamics, writing in a notebook about the impermanence of life, the fragility of the human condition, and the ways in which a single person's choices could ripple through a family, a community, a nation. The entries were not loud. They were reflective, a testament to a person who understood that legacy is not a ledger of yards, but a constellation of lives touched. In April 2004, Pat's unit prepared for redeployment, this time into deeper, more dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. He wrote to his wife with a tone that was tender and ironclad at once. "I don't expect to make it home. But if anything happens, I want you to know I have no regrets." The words carried a prophecy of a sort, not in their certainty of fate, but in their clarity about intention. There would be no posthumous excuses, no revisionist apologies, only a straight line from belief to action. As the Chinook blades throbbed above the desert, Pat stood with his unit, looking out at the jagged silhouettes of mountains that met the horizon like a challenge. The air tasted of dust and resolve. There was no roar of a crowd, no camera, no contract to anchor him to a public stage. Just duty, and a man who believed that some truths were more important than any headline could ever be. He walked away from glory to chase honor, and on a distant Afghan ridge that choice would demand everything he had left to give. The first steps of deployment are never grand. They arrive as routine logistics, as pages flipping in a notebook of orders, as the steady hum of engines and the dry sting of sand in the throat. Pat Tillman stood among soldiers who wore their fear like a quiet oath, not to flaunt it, but to carry it forward with discipline. In Afghanistan, the terrain becomes a character with a history of loss. Gnarled ridges, dust that sticks to gear, winds that carry the memory of every battlefield. Pat found himself in a unit where every man carried a different story of home, a different version of what enduring meant. He listened more than he spoke, letting the others tell him what fear sounded like in their own voices, what hope looked like when crouched in a foxhole at night. He wrote little about combat in those days, but he carried a weight in him that grew heavier with each mission, with every exhortation from command, with the quiet realization that the world he had left behind would never truly understand the terrain he now walked. War is not a single act. It is a chorus of decisions under pressure, where every choice echoes beyond the moment. Pat's letters home, glimpsed through the half-light of memory, reveal a man who did not abandon thought to the heat of battle. He asked questions that soldiers sometimes fear to voice. What is the value of a life when the cost is measured in cycles of return and loss? How do you hold on to your humanity when the machine of war tempts you to become a function, not a person? There were moments when he stood in the shadow of a hill or a ruined village and wondered about the line between duty and sacrifice. He spoke in a voice that trusted in duty, but not in easy answers. He wrote about the fragility of life, about the people he met, locals who shared their meals with soldiers not out of obligation, but out of a stubborn hospitality that refused to surrender to fear. This is where the story pulls us into the deeper question. Heroism in war is not merely the bravado of a moment, but the steadiness of a conscience when the world seems to tilt toward chaos. In the field, every action has a footprint in dust, a footprint on a map, a footprint in the memory of a family awaiting a letter that might never come. Pat's courage was never about theatrics. It was about showing up when things were hardest, when the ground beneath your feet refused to offer guarantees. There are moments in a soldier's life when luck and fate seem to hum a quiet tune, and Pat, with his characteristic blend of humility and determination, walked through those moments without demanding a spotlight. He spoke softly about the burden of responsibility, about the weight of living up to a lineage of service, and about the reality that every decision in harm's way alters someone's life, sometimes forever. In the brutality of a live-fire environment, people often find what they are made of. Pat's bond with his squad grew into something beyond camaraderie, a chosen family bound not by blood but by shared risk and shared resolve. They learned to trust each other's instincts, to rely on the quiet strength of a man who would rather listen than speak, who would rather act with fidelity to his beliefs than seek a quick median. Even as danger pressed in from every side, Pat's focus remained on small acts of integrity, checking on a teammate who seemed withdrawn, volunteering for the hardest tasks, resisting the ease of shortcuts that fear or fatigue might tempt. He did not measure his worth by medals won, but by the steadiness with which he faced the next challenge, the next dawn, the next obligation. There is a humbler part of heroism that often goes unlauded, the daily rhythm of showing up, of doing the right thing when no one is watching. Pat embodied this quiet discipline. He asked the questions that others deferred. What does it mean to honor those who came before us? How do we reconcile one life with the larger tapestry of a nation's history? Letters home hint at a man who believed that courage resides in restraint as well as action, in choosing not to escape, not to seek drama for its own sake, but to stay the course with tenderness for those around him. He carried with him a sense of gratitude for the opportunities he had, paired with an unwavering determination to use those opportunities in service to something greater than himself. Every journey has a pivot, a moment when the future splits into paths that demand different kinds of courage. For Pat, that pivot was neither a single event nor a solitary decision, but a continuous alignment of values with the demands of reality. He did not arrive in Afghanistan seeking a posthumous legend. He arrived seeking clarity about what it means to be a man who can look in the mirror and still say, "I am doing right by what I believe in." In those long nights under a heavy sky, his inner voice grew louder than the rifle's echo. The cost of staying, of continuing to serve in a role that demanded constant sacrifice, began to weigh visibly against the dream of stadium lights and applause. The narrative of Tillman was shifting from a spectacular ascent to a quiet, determined continuation of service. A different kind of heroism, one measured not by the length of a public ledger, but by the depth of a personal vow kept. Communication with home becomes a lifeline when the world narrows to the texture of a single moment. Pat's letter to his wife, written in the cadence of a man who had learned to trust his own instincts, carried a message that transcended fear. "I don't regret the days I have lived or the road I have chosen. If danger comes, I want you to know that I have no regrets about this choice." In Afghanistan, the letters were not just words. They were a bridge back to a life that remained, stubbornly, a possibility. They reminded him that every action taken in the present would resound in the future, in the memory of a child who would one day ask where their father's courage began. War also has a fourth wall, a line between the spectator and the participant that the public rarely notices until it is broken. In Tillman's world, the public gaze, televisions, headlines, the constant hum of social discourse, could not stand still at the edge of the trench. He faced that gaze with a remarkable composure, choosing to convert visibility into responsibility rather than spectacle. He understood that his life would be seen differently now, not as the arc of athletic achievement, but as an example of a deeper duty. The attention could be used to illuminate truth, about sacrifice, about the human cost of national choices, and about the necessity of questioning authority when a path seems to move away from the center of one's own beliefs. Pat Tillman did not disappear from the public eye. He transformed the measure of what it means to serve. The flag he wore was not merely a symbol of national pride, but a covenant with the people who believed in him to carry their stories into danger and back again. The narrative arrives at a threshold, the realization that a life dedicated to service must endure beyond the withdrawal from a battlefield. Tillman's story, in this Afghan chapter, is a continuous act of courage, not the flash of a heroic moment on a highlight reel, but the quiet, stubborn decision to stay true to a core belief in the value of human life, the dignity of those who stand beside you, and the obligation to carry your country's best ideals into the most challenging terrain. As the miles of desert, the cold intensity of night patrols, and the weight of duty press forward, the question remains: what does it mean to walk toward danger, not for glory, but for a deeper, often less visible good? Pat Tillman's journey through Afghanistan is a map of choices: to act with integrity, to remain humble under pressure, to bear witness to the humanity that persists even amid the harshest conditions. The story does not end with triumph over enemies alone. It ends with a human legacy that endures because it refuses to be reduced to a headline. The courage Tillman embodies lives in the quiet moments, in a letter home, in a whispered prayer before a patrol, in the decision to stand firm when the ground shakes and fear rises like a tide. Pat Tillman's choices did not stay confined to his person. They braided themselves into everyday life, into the quiet rituals of a family left to chart a future without a husband, a brother, a son whose presence had once filled a room with certainty. In Tempe and in Fremont, voices rose and fell with noting. His wife, his siblings, and his aging parents learned to live with the memory of a decision that had redefined them as much as it had defined him. Letters and interviews gathered from the years after Afghanistan reveal a man who spoke of gratitude for ordinary moments, a shared meal, a child's small victory, a quiet evening that didn't demand a public stage. The core question lingered. How do you measure a life that has already reshaped the lives of others? The answer, as flexible as it is stubborn, came through patience, listening, and a willingness to let the memory of Tillman be lived out, not merely described. Tillman E.'s move from hero to memory maker is a cultural transition familiar to many who have given too much of themselves to become symbols. Communities began to tell their own versions of the story, not as a single arc of glory, but as a mosaic of small acts that echo his philosophy: duty, humility, accountability. The public narrative shifted, from the stadium's roar to the quiet neighborhoods where banners and small plaques appeared, honoring a life that refused to be consumed by vanity. Schools incorporated his lessons on purpose. Veterans groups invoked his handwriting on a letter home as a reminder that service is a rhythm, not a momentary beat. In this sense, Pat Tillman became less a name and more a practice, a standard by which others measured how to live with the weight of their own choices, how to speak truths even when they are unpopular, and how to carry forward a heritage that demands ongoing reflection. The letters he penned, those fragile threads from front lines to familiar walls, began to travel beyond the pages that bore them. Scholars and readers found in those lines a voice that sought not to glorify peril, but to dignify moral complexity. The letters were not a shield against the chaos of war. They were a bridge to the people who waited at home. The wife, the mother, the friend who needed to hear that courage can be a quiet thing too. Public statements and interviews drifted into a space where the personal and the political meet, not in fireworks but in careful articulation. A belief in humility, a distrust of easy slogans, and a commitment to truth-telling even when the truth is uncomfortable. The national memory learned to hold both a soldier's valor and a citizen's doubt. The idea that heroism can be measured not only by battlefield outcomes, but by the way a life is spent in alignment with deeply held convictions. A central tension of the legacy is the ongoing debate about the morality of war and the ethics of sacrifice. Tillman's example invites both reverence and vigorous discussion. What is the price of a life lived for a cause bigger than oneself? How do families reconcile pride with sorrow? How does a nation balance gratitude with scrutiny when a story of sacrifice becomes a vector for policy, memory, and public sentiment? In living rooms and lecture halls, discussions unfold with the same quiet intensity Pat once brought to training fields and deployment briefs. Some argue that his choices remind a country to pause before leaping into the next conflict. Others see in his path a reminder that there are people whose stories are inseparable from the agendas of nations. The ambiguity is not a flaw, but a feature of a living memory that provokes thought rather than dogma. Tillman's legacy thus becomes a case study in how to hold complexity, to honor a life saved by precision in action, while also acknowledging the imperfect, costly realities of war that persist long after the last bullet is fired. Even in sports culture, Tillman's arc leaves an imprint. He remains a touchstone in conversations about athletes as citizens, about how fame intersects with responsibility, and about the ways in which the platform of professional athletics can be used to illuminate larger truths rather than simply magnify personal achievement. Coaches, teammates, and commentators revisit his decisions not to celebrate them as reckless or naive, but to analyze them as a rare example of moral seriousness, a warning and an invitation that success can be redefined not only by money or records, but by the willingness to bear responsibility for the consequences of one's choices. The media, too, grapples with the tension between storytelling for engagement and storytelling for accountability. Tillman's story challenges producers to present a narrative that respects nuance. The hunger for a good story must not eclipse the truth of the human cost embedded in every chapter of his life. Tillman's life, by design, never sought to magnify the self. Whether in the quiet of a letter's closing, the restrained cadence of an interview, or the measured decisions about where and how to serve, he demonstrated that real strength can look like restraint, that leadership can be quiet, and that heroism can reside in the ordinary compromises of daily life. Families reported that their memory of him was not a pedestal, but a compass, a reminder to ask honest questions, to measure success by how much one has served others, and to accept that a legacy can grow in the wake of questions rather than in the echo of applause. Memorial rituals and annual remembrances became the country's own way of staying awake to Tillman's example. National vigils, local commemorations, and small private ceremonies formed a spectrum of remembrance that kept his voice in circulation. Not as a distant legend, but as a neighbor's story, a student's inquiry, a veteran's oath. In classrooms, teachers invite discussion about duty, loyalty, and the moral calculus of war. In sports arenas, athletes are reminded that their platforms carry responsibility beyond highlight reels. In families, Tillman's memory is a quiet mentor, guiding conversations about sacrifice, resilience, and what it means to be part of something larger than one's self. Tillman's life teaches that legacy is not a monument in granite, but a living conversation, a constant re-examination of what we owe to those who came before us and to those who will follow. As new generations inherit his example, the question remains not merely what he did, but how we choose to carry forward the spirit of his decisions. With honesty when confronted with complexity, with humility when confronted with power, and with steadfast commitment to the idea that some acts of courage endure, not because they erase fear, but because they persist in the face of it. No archive is ever truly closed. In basements, libraries, and digital vaults, conversations about Tillman endure. Journalists who chased the man behind the headlines, mutual friends who saw him in moments of stillness, and scholars who pore over letters and interviews, all of them bring Tillman back into the room, not as a relic, but as a living prompt. We listen to the cadence of old interviews, the careful restraint in his voice, the way he chose questions over easy answers. We hear new readers ask, was his path a blueprint or a protest against the blueprint? Each re-airing of old footage or reread paragraph adds another layer, another texture to a life already multi-layered. The family remains the most intimate archive. Pat Tillman's wife, siblings, and parents carry the memory in every ordinary act. A holiday meal, a phone call that stretches into the night, a photograph that refuses to fade. They speak softly about how a decision once personal becomes communal property, a shared responsibility to preserve nuance, to resist simplifying heroism into a single line. We hear how they teach the younger generation to hold multiple truths, pride in sacrifice, sorrow for what was lost, and the ongoing gratitude for a life lived with intention. Their memories are not museum pieces, they are living instructions on how to be human when history presses on the heart. Tillman's story has traveled into classrooms, think tanks, and civic forums. In universities, students debate the ethics of sport, celebrity, and military service. In veteran communities, elders recount lessons on resilience and accountability. In policy discussions, commentators test how individual acts of conscience align with collective security. This scene is a mosaic of voices, a veteran who frames Tillman as a case study in civilian military ethics, a coach who recalls the moment Tillman chose duty over the spotlight and its implications for leadership, a teacher who uses Tillman's letters to spark conversations about truth-telling and moral complexity. Media narratives walk a labyrinth, the hunger for a compelling arc, the risk of flattening complexity, and the duty to honor truth over sensationalism. Tillman's story invites reporters, editors, and documentarians to ask hard questions about how to represent sacrifice without erasing consequence. We examine moments when the public frame shifted, from hero worship to critical reflection, and consider how future storytellers can balance admiration with accountability. The aim is not to dethrone the hero, but to restore the human to the center of the story. A person who chose to stand for something larger than self-interest, while navigating the imperfect realities of war and politics. If Tillman's legacy endures, It's partly because younger generations hear his name and ask, what does service look like now? The conversation widens to include students who volunteer locally, athletes who fundraise for veterans, and families who support education and healing in the aftermath of conflict. In these voices, we hear a mosaic of motivations: curiosity, duty, curiosity again, and a recurring question: how can one honor sacrifice in a world where the meaning of sacrifice itself evolves with time and circumstance? Memory is both a compass and a constraint. It guides communities toward values they want to uphold, but it can also freeze a story in a single frame. Part 4 asks how to keep Tillman's memory alive without letting it ossify, how to let the questions he posed keep circulating, and how to translate memory into ongoing action, in schools and policies, in everyday kindness. We explore memorials that do more than commemorate. They invite action, scholarships that fund students who pursue public service, community programs that emphasize humility alongside courage, and public dialogues that invite disagreement as a form of respect for truth. As the living record grows, so does the responsibility to document with care. This scene looks at how footnotes, citations, and contextual anchors function in a narrative about real people. We consider questions of attribution, sources' reliability, and the imperative to distinguish between remembered feeling and verifiable fact. The aim is not pedantry, but integrity, to preserve the nuance of Tillman's mindset, and to enable future historians, journalists, and storytellers to trace ideas back to their origins, even as the story expands into new chapters and new experiences. Tillman's life challenges each listener to examine their own choices. The question is not only, what did he do, but what would I do in the face of similar moral pressure? Through intimate vignettes, a parent teaching a child about gratitude, a student debating a policy shift, a veteran recounting a moment of decision, we see that the tale of Tillman is also a mirror for every reader. The personal becomes universal, and the universal becomes personal again, as each voice adds to the living record and pledges to keep truth, empathy, and courage at the center of their own lives. As new interviews emerge, as new generations reinterpret sacrifice, may the dialogue be guided by humility, clarity, and a shared commitment to the values that made Tillman choose the harder, truer path. If a life stands for sacrifice, the next question is how society can honor that sacrifice through structure. Tillman's story invites policymakers to consider what systems encourage ethical decision-making among those who serve, whether in uniform in public life or in the smallest acts of civic engagement. We explore concrete avenues, veterans support integrated with education and employment pathways, transparent accountability in the portrayal of service in media and schools, funding for research on veteran well-being that goes beyond wound counts to include social and psychological health. The through line is practical humility, recognizing that symbols alone cannot sustain a healthy democracy. They must be grounded in policies that nurture resilience, learning, and opportunity for all who choose to serve. Tillman's legacy lives in streets, schools, and town halls where people choose to act. This scene highlights community programs designed to reenact the best parts of his example: mentorship for at-risk youth, veteran-led peer support networks, and service learning curricula in high schools and colleges. We listen to veterans who mentor young athletes, to teachers who use Tillman's letters as springboards for ethics discussions, and to nonprofit organizers who frame service as a communal practice rather than a solitary virtue. The ripple effect becomes clear. When communities invest in everyday acts of service, the national character strengthens in the crowded moments of ordinary life. Education is where memory becomes informed judgment. Tillman's narrative offers a scaffold for teaching critical thinking about courage, sacrifice, and responsibility. This scene surveys initiatives in civics, history, and ethics that encourage students to ask nuanced questions. Why do people choose duty over comfort? How should a society balance national security needs with individual rights and human costs? We spotlight curricula, teacher training, and classroom dialogues designed to cultivate moral imagination, the ability to imagine competing responsibilities, weigh consequences, and articulate reasoned positions with empathy and respect for opposing views. In a media ecosystem that rewards immediacy, Tillman's story challenges outlets to maintain nuance without sacrificing engagement. This segment analyzes journalistic practices that protect context, sourcing that respects privacy, and accuracy, balancing personal narrative with systemic analysis and presenting multiple perspectives on controversial questions about war, patriotism, and public policy. We hear from editors, watchdogs, and veteran media professionals who argue for a press culture that honors complexity, correctness, and a commitment to the truth even when it complicates a tidy narrative. Service is not merely an act, it's an ecosystem of incentives, recognition, and sustainability. Examines how societies reward enduring commitments, scholarships for public service with a focus on ethics, grants for community projects that demonstrate measurable social impact, and recognition programs that highlight long-term contributions over singular hero moments. These mechanisms, when designed with humility and equity, extend Tillman's ethos into a durable social contract, that a life dedicated to others deserves not only admiration, but practical support that makes continued service possible. Tillman's narrative invites leaders in all sectors to adopt a personal accountability charter, transparency about motives, willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and a steadfast commitment to aligning words with deeds. This scene sketches a blueprint for leadership that blends courage with accountability, where decisions are explained with integrity, and where leaders model the hard work of ethical reflection under pressure. Through interviews with public figures, community organizers, and scholars, we chart how the private discipline of Tillman's life translates into public decision-making that sustains trust and legitimacy. Impact is rarely captured in a single moment or metric. How to measure the enduring influence of Tillman's example. Longitudinal studies of veterans' reintegration, shifts in public attitudes toward service and sacrifice, and the ways generations learn to balance freedom with responsibility. The aim is not to pretend certainty where there is nuance, but to establish a framework for ongoing assessment that informs better policies, stronger communities, and more meaningful acts of service. Ideas require execution. We close with a practical roadmap, a sequence of steps that institutions and individuals can take over the next 5 to 10 years. Embed ethics training in initial military and civilian service programs. Create cross-sector fellowships that pair veterans with public interest organizations. Fund community-based research on the social determinants of veteran well-being. Develop public-facing narratives that honor complexity and invite dialogue, not polarization. Establish annual reviews of service-related policies to ensure they adapt to changing realities. These actions, grounded in Tillman's commitment to truth-telling, aim to transform memory into momentum. Tillman's legacy is not a verdict etched in granite, but a living invitation to each generation to translate courage into responsibility, to convert memory into measurable benefit, and to keep faith with the idea that serving something larger than oneself is a practice that can be learned, shared, and improved. The earliest echoes of Tillman's legacy begin in kitchens, gymnasiums, and church halls. Mothers recount conversations with sons and daughters who discovered courage not on a stage, but in the quiet perseverance of everyday life. Coaches recall athletes who choose to put team above self, veterans who mentor young neighbors, and students who organize service projects that echo Tillman's ethic of purpose with humility. We listen to the cadence of voices who knew him, and to those who only know what his choices symbolize. A call to question easy answers, to seek truth through action, and to translate memory into meaningful deeds. Tillman's footprint migrates from national headlines to the local streets where ordinary people do extraordinary things. A volunteer firefighter who puts out a blaze with calm, a teacher who uses a Tillman letter as a classroom catalyst, a small business owner who funds veteran readiness programs. These are the local heroes who keep the flame of service alive in tangible ways. We explore how communities recognize and amplify these acts. Micro-grants for youth leadership, neighborhood service days, and intergenerational mentoring that builds resilience across ages. The conversation about Tillman becomes a living dialogue across generations. Teenagers ask if sacrifice still matters in a world of instant updates and globalized answers. Parents share guidance on discernment, responsibility, and the courage to say no to pressure when it clashes with core values. Story circles, public talks, and online forums become forms of moral education, where the past informs the present, and the present reinterprets the past with fresh nuance. The through line remains clear. Listening deeply to one another fosters a culture where courage is a choice repeatedly renewed. Beyond individual stories, Tillman's ethos roots itself in institutions that outlast any single career. Scholarships for public service evolve into long-term pipelines. Veterans centers become hubs for lifelong learning. School curricula adapt to teach ethical reasoning as a daily practice rather than a historical footnote. We hear from administrators, donors, and community organizers about the design principles that sustain these programs: equity, transparency, measurable impact, and a relentless focus on human well-being. Public memory wears many masks: billboards and banners, anniversaries and anniversaries that feel personal. Part 6 examines how public rituals can honor without sanitizing, how ceremonies can invite critique, questions, and new interpretations that keep Tillman's legacy dynamic rather than decorative. Personal stories mingle with public events: a veteran sharing a moment of vulnerability at a town hall, a student presenting a project on moral courage, a family member reflecting on how a choice once made shapes daily living. In every community, there are moments when tough choices arise. Allocating scarce resources for veterans' services, balancing security concerns with civil liberties, or deciding how to tell a difficult truth in a public setting. Tillman's life provides a compass, not a map, guiding discussions that honor complexity and resist simplification. We listen to panels and roundtables where participants model ethical deliberation, stating premises clearly, acknowledging uncertainty, and valuing empathy alongside accountability. Tillman's legacy does not belong to one generation or one sector. It belongs to the continuous exchange of action, reflection, and renewal that occurs in every neighborhood touched by his story. The living memorial is a practice of service, of honesty, and of sustaining communities through shared commitments. Around the world, communities reinterpret Tillman's choices through their own histories of service, sacrifice, and citizenship. In classrooms in Europe, in volunteer centers in Asia, in civic forums in Africa, people ask, what does it mean to stand for something larger than oneself in a world of rapid change and interdependence? We listen to educators, veterans, and humanitarian workers who translate Tillman's ethic into culturally resonant actions: mentoring in refugee schools, veterans reconciliation programs, disaster response leadership, and cross-cultural service exchanges that pair young leaders across continents. This scene features voices from different nations who have encountered Tillman's narrative in diverse ways. A student in a university discussion in London questions the myth of heroism and seeks a pragmatic ethics. A village elder in a coastal town in the Philippines speaks of resilience and community care. A policy analyst in Nairobi examines the balance between security, human rights, and public trust. The through line is clear. Despite linguistic and cultural differences, the core questions remain universal: how to act with integrity, how to manage power responsibly, and how to build systems that sustain service over time. In the policy sphere, Tillman's story prompts international collaboration on shared frameworks for service. We explore cross-border initiatives, international fellowships that encourage service learning between countries, joint research on veteran well-being that includes social and economic dimensions, and global dialogues on ethical leadership and accountability in both military and civilian life. We hear from policymakers, NGO leaders, and scholars who argue that a universal language of service can emerge from common principles: humility, truth-telling, and equitable opportunity for all who choose to serve. Tillman's narrative travels through cultural forms beyond policy and education. Artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians in multiple cultures reframe the story, using metaphor and memory to explore courage, doubt, and the human costs of conflict. We sample excerpts from translated memoirs, world cinema, and public art installations that render Tillman's choices as a shared human experience rather than a singular American tale. These works invite audiences to see themselves in Tillman's questions, to recognize their own responsibilities within global communities, and to imagine new forms of solidarity. The final through line links the global to the local, how international insights translate into everyday acts of service in neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. The idea is not cultural appropriation of a narrative, but the respectful adaptation of universal ethics to local needs. We spotlight case studies, international volunteer corps that operate in conflict-affected areas with emphasis on community-led solutions, school curricula that incorporate global citizenship alongside local civic responsibility, and intercultural mentorship programs that cultivate empathy and cross-border cooperation. Tillman's legacy, reframed on a global canvas, suggests that service is a language spoken in many dialects. The universal dream is not sameness but shared responsibility, to care for others, to question power, to pursue truth, and to build institutions that sustain dignity for all people, wherever they are. We begin by listening for the through lines that survive across chapters: humility as strength, truth-telling as courage, and responsibility as a daily discipline. This scene offers a concise synthesis of the arc, from personal sacrifice to public accountability, from symbolic reverence to measurable impact, and from local acts of kindness to global conversations about shared humanity. We hear brief reflections from scholars, veterans, educators, and family members who see in Tillman's choices a framework rather than a creed, adaptable, critical, and relentlessly humane. The family voices anchor the narrative in intimate truth. Parents and siblings describe how memory becomes a compass for younger generations, how to honor a life as a living example rather than a static monument, how to teach discernment when the world offers easy narratives, how to model service as a practice that evolves with time. These reflections remind us that continuity is not stagnation but stewardship, handing forward a set of questions, not a fixed set of answers. If memory builds policies and curricula, then how do we ensure those structures endure? This scene surveys the essential ingredients of a durable public framework: adaptable education on ethics, transparent governance in how service is funded and measured, and robust civic platforms that invite debate rather than polarization. Leaders, educators, and citizens share visions for a living system where service is accessible to all, where veterans and civilians grow together, and where accountability remains a shared responsibility. How we capture meaning. It proposes a multidimensional measurement approach: qualitative stories of resilience, longitudinal studies of reintegration, community well-being indicators, and indicators of ethical leadership in institutions. We explore the idea that true impact blends tangible results with shifts in attitudes toward humility, courage under scrutiny, and the willingness to keep asking hard questions. At the core of this installment lies a proposed living contract, a covenant among people, institutions, and governments to uphold certain commitments. The contract centers on continuous ethics education for all who serve, inclusive pathways to public service and leadership, transparent storytelling that respects complexity, persistent investment in community resilience and mutual aid, regular public dialogues that welcome critique and evolution. This is not a rigid policy document, but a dynamic pact that invites renewal as circumstances change. The conversation circles back to scale. How do global insights inform local action, and how do local commitments scale back to global good? We revisit the tensions and opportunities of cross-border learning, intercultural exchange, and shared humanitarian ethics, while reaffirming the primacy of everyday acts of care that sustain a community. It is this: memory is a living practice and service is a civic muscle that strengthens with use. Each listener is invited to participate in the living contract, to teach a child courage, mentor a colleague, volunteer in a neighborhood, advocate for just policies, and engage in the ongoing dialogue that makes a society worthy of the trust placed in it by those who came before us. Next time, a closing credits moment, we reflect on the series, acknowledge silent contributors, and outline opportunities for ongoing engagement, scholarship, and community action. If you believe true heroism lives beyond headlines, subscribe. Here at American Veteran Stories, we keep their names alive, their courage remembered, and their legacy shared. one story at a time.